Looks like it's time. Welcome back, everyone. So we're having our third review for the upcoming third exam. It's going to be next Monday, which means on the 20th, next Monday, we won't hold class since it's conceivable that someone might schedule their exam during their ordinary class time. Plus, that'd just be too much going on in one day anyways, too many commitments in 1 week. This exam is going to be based off these 5 units, so just chapter 5 on statistical reasoning. And that means this exam is a little bit different than the others. Exams 1 and 2 are more computational, working with formulas and units, getting values. This one's a little bit more conceptual. So in a certain sense, it feels a little bit different than what we've done before. But in another sense, it should feel like the same things that we've actually been doing for my lab. The problems that you did in the homework system are going to be similar to the problems that I'm going to assign from these sections. Another great hint about this particular exam, really the same for any other exam in the final as well. Great way to be prepared for this is to make sure you're caught up with those quizzes. And those are quiz problems that you should be prepared to do in any exam situation. Essentially, when I write a quiz problem, it's kind of a test run to see how it works as an exam question. So quiz 11 is due today. I think this one is not based on exam 3, but quizzes starting around 10 going backwards until you get to the Unit 5A quiz. I forget exactly what number that is. Those would be good to review. If you haven't gotten one in, if one went late, that's a good place to start, just getting caught up. And same with the MyLab homework. You could do those late for full credit as well. Once you're fully caught up on quizzes and the MyLab homework, then it'd be a good idea to turn into either version of the sample exam. Version 1 is my way to take lecture notes and say which problems out of the lecture notes actually look like good exam questions. So they're questions we've seen before. And these are all brand new questions based off version 1. Well, any questions or comments about the upcoming exam so far? Okay, even though there's lots of conceptual stuff there are a few spots where we're doing some computations. I think you might recall in Unit 5C doing things along the lines of a frequency table, a relative frequency table, a cumulative frequency table. So just as before, be sure to remember to bring a calculator. The testing center that you go to may not necessarily have a spare one, and they could run out even if they do give spares. So make sure to not forget to bring your calculator. Other advice I would give on the exam is, as far as these units go, I'm going to be asking exactly 8 questions on this particular exam. And I felt like it'd be a good idea, just because it's such a different exam, to give a pretty good breakdown. For example, Unit 5A was huge. I think we spent like 2.5 days there. Some of the other units were not as big, some of them were more bigger. So this document right here is right here, exam 3 review. And any review problem we do, we're going to update and republish it right there on this week, week 13. And this gives you kind of a guide on what's really going to be on the third exam. So it's going to focus on 8 questions, kind of corresponding to the amount of time we spent on the unit for the most part. Unit 5A will be a question on identifying population sample parameter statistic. Another question on identifying the sampling method, whether it's a stratified sample, simple random sample, and so on. Determining if a study is an observational study or an experiment. For Unit 5B, this one was a lot shorter, and I think people kind of like this section. There's a lot of participation in these kind of problems. This is where you'll use the guidelines of evaluating if a study should be trustworthy or not, if the conclusions should be trusted, or if we have reason to doubt the conclusions. It says use the guidelines of evaluating the study, but that's where if you were doing this exam question on the real exam 3, you would probably flip to the exam 3 formula sheet. Just like the other exams, this is provided on the real exam 3. So when you go to write out your page of notes of this size, front and back, with anything you'd like on it, good idea is to make sure you look at this page first. This was some of the definitions. This is a problem that we were highlighting, determining a sampling method. These are the 8 guidelines for evaluating a statistical study. Even though I'm calling it a formula sheet, it's all just definitions. There's no actual formula there. But these will be the provided information on the third exam. So that will help us on doing this portion right here. As far as what goes on your notes, again, you can put anything you like, other definitions, other formulas, problems and such, anything that you think is going to be helpful on the exam. For the next unit, statistical tables and graphs, this one is going to have 2 questions. First question is, like we mentioned, here's where you're going to need a calculator, where you'll construct a frequency table, relative frequency, a table with a frequency column, a relative frequency column is a better way to say it, and a cumulative frequency column. And then you'll construct either a bar graph or a histogram. And I recall this one being kind of a tricky problem on the notes, or on the quiz. So let's mention right away here, a bar graph has gaps between categories, and a histogram does not. So Unit 5C is kind of tricky in a couple ways. You'll be constructing a table with specific columns, and I'll also ask you to hand draw a graph, one or the other, not both. So our quiz was based on the histogram, but you could expect either or. Pretty much what I did is it used a random number generator to select one or the other. So you'll only have to hand draw one graph, same as what we did in the Unit 5C. Then going beyond that, Unit 5D was a little bit longer. The graphs were a little bit trickier, but I only asked one for this particular exam. You're only going to analyze one graph. So take a look at what you did on the quiz, what we did on the lecture notes or the new sample exam, and I'll give you a good idea of what all could happen on that one question there. Then final unit on the exam, this is the one with the scatter plots, dealing with correlation and causation. Here's where we went to and looked at, looked at plots that went about like this. We had to determine the direction and strength of the correlation, whether it was going up or down, positive or negative, how strong it was, then say what conclusions can be drawn, depending on what we said in part A. So the last part is also going to be determining if it's reasonable to conclude a cause and effect relationship based on the information we see and the context. So that's pretty much our roundup for what's going to be on the exam. My intention is not to write a longer exam. I think exam 1 came out longer than the ones I would really like. Exam 2 was about right, and I'm trying to keep it well contained on exam 3. So just these 8 specific kinds of questions. Well, again, that's the roundup of what could be on the third exam. Any questions about this information here, or any questions or folks would like to start out?
I haven't looked at the actual exam 3 review problems yet, but I was wondering if we could go over a question that would be correlation, strength, and direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good call. So this one has really 3 different parts that could be assessed on that kind of question. So let's pull one out just like that. So I've got the formula sheet here. This is version 1, which just means these are the problems that we solved. And here are the brand new ones. Let's go to the bottom. At the very, very end of this document are solutions. So if you want to see a different take on how they could be solved, you could go down there. And I want one with a part C on it. There we go, because that one has the cause and effect baked into it as well. So this looks like it'll do the job. Okay, let me throw that in. Okay, so here's where we'll start out. Thanks for picking a direction to go for our first problem. And this one is not too different actually than the one that we did in the lecture notes. It says, An environmental science research group is studying the logistics of natural disaster response, things like fire trucks and the such. They analyze data from 50 significant flash flood events across the Intermountain West over the last decade. The scatter plot shows the number of emergency response vehicles. I guess that could also be all sorts of things, helicopters and so on, deployed to each event versus the total estimated infrastructure damage in thousands of dollars caused by that flood. So we're looking into flash floods in the Intermountain West over the last 10 years. This was the number of emergency vehicles deployed on the horizontal axis, going from just below 20 to just above 80 vehicles for one flash flood. That's a pretty big response. And on this axis, going vertically, is the estimated infrastructure damage in thousands of dollars. So that's the context so far. And let's run through the questions. We have to decide if there's correlation. This one doesn't look like white noise where the points are random. There is true correlation. That means there should be a direction. What would you all say the direction should be for this graph? Does that look like a positive or negative direction?
It looks like a positive correlation. I did see in the MyLab notes that they had mentioned weak correlation and strong correlation. So I was wondering if that's going to be kind of included or it'll just be positive or negative.
Yeah, it will also include that second part you're mentioning on the strength, whether it's weak or strong, or if you feel like it's in the middle and just say moderate strength or middle of the road strength, that'd be a fine response as well. But I'm going to try to keep it really clear when there's a strong one, because again, to really address the strength of the correlation, you'd have to calculate the statistic to really give a good feel for that. So if it ever came out as, say, strong, it should look a little bit more like this graph here. The strong one, the very strong relationship is going to be a dead giveaway because it's going to look like the points are very close. I'm going to try not to give too many problems that are kind of in the middle of the road. So if it looks something like this, it would be as far as the strength of the relationship, I would say strong, or very strong is fine as well. If it looks something more like this, where there's a decent spread of the points, either weak or moderate would be fine for responses. And if it happens to look like this is the one case where we would have to say no correlation whatsoever. So that means on our problem, I wouldn't call this one a strong relationship. I would call it, first, the direction, as you said. There is a positive correlation. The points are pretty spread out, though. Let me just put these two together. So that's the direction it's going. And the relationship, I would say moderate is probably a good answer for this. It's not as spread out as some graphs we've seen. So if you said moderate, that'd be pretty good. Let's put it here, moderate. But I want to also emphasize, if you said or weak, I'd be okay with that as well. It's kind of a subjective response we're giving. The only thing that could lose us credit is if we said this relationship is strong on this one, because it definitely has some pretty good spread. Well, any questions or comments about this one? Okay, the next part is, tricky in its own right as well, because it's kind of a process, really. When we're drawing the conclusion, we have to bring in the context. So let's mention that as the major advice here. Must use the context. But if you're using the context, all you're really doing is citing the values that you see for a horizontal and the vertical axis. Rereading the context doesn't hurt as well. but this is the flood response versus infrastructure damage. We're talking about 50 significant flash flood events. But you don't have to necessarily write paragraphs. You can say just simply, as the number of emergency vehicle deployed increases, okay, that's a long variable name. So as the number of emergency vehicles deployed increases, here we're reading the graph going left to right. So we're imagining just that one variable getting higher and higher. This variable is either going up or down, but if you said positive correlation, we see that it's actually going up. So we'll say the estimated infrastructure damage also tends to increase. So this is going up as the horizontal variable goes up as well. It increases because we said it's in the positive direction. Well, any questions at all, folks, with either parts A or B? Okay, then finally, the wording here is kind of touchy in a certain sense, but I'm not going to be too picky with how you word it in part B. I try to be careful by saying as the emergency vehicles increases, in the estimated infrastructure damage tends to increase. What I mean here when I say the word tends to increase is it's not a very exact rule. The points are kind of jumping up and down, but one is associated with another as one is increasing with the other. What I don't want to say is one is causing the other to increase. So I try to avoid language that say the higher number of emergency vehicles causes higher infrastructure damage, because that's where we could get in trouble with the part C there. When it asks if there's a cause and effect relationship between the two variables, in some cases that might be a yes, so we have to carefully analyze the context. But for this case, much like the one that we did in the lecture notes, I would say that this one would be a no. We have to explain this is about flash floods, but as far as flash floods go, it's the severity of the flash flood that's affecting both the number of emergency vehicles deployed and the total amount of damage that's being estimated. So we'll say here briefly, no, the two variables aren't causally related. There is a variable influencing both of these variables. And that variable will give a name. It's the severity of the flash flood itself. Well, that's again, a pretty typical problem from the last section analyzing the scatter plot. There'll be three parts on our particular exam. As far as the final exam goes, it could be one like this with 3 parts or maybe just 2 parts. That one I'll let be randomly selected. Any last thoughts on this one, folks, before we pick another? And just for the sake of the notes, if you come back to this one is unit 5, and I forget the numbering, 5E. So we've done the 5E problem, and we still have a good amount of time to go through. As far as the remaining problems go, there's definitely some good ones to pick here. I'll leave it up to the class. If anyone has another direction you'd like to go, feel free to throw it out in chat as well. If you have any other question you'd like to talk about for the review, don't hesitate to throw it out. So anyone have a new direction to go for our next question?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about 5C next. On the sample 3 problems version 1, could we go over example 1?
Yeah, so sample 3, version 1, and this was 5C. Yeah, absolutely. Let me find that one. So this one here,
Yep, that one.
awesome. So yeah, something like this targets this part of the write-up, constructing a table with these specific columns. So let's give this one a try. There's another one just like this one, but in a different context on the version 2 of the sample exam as well. And what I did on the exam is I actually put in a table for us so that we'll be plugging down values just to save it a little bit of time. So what do we have here? We're dealing with exoplanets, and we want frequency, relative, and cumulative. So let's put a table that goes like this just to match the real exam a little bit better. I think I want about 4 altogether. And then I'm not too sure on the number of rows. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4. That should do the job. So I'll put on this first column, category, of exoplanet. Then we need to build out the frequency, relative frequency, and cumulative frequency. So now I think I also filled out this information here. So there's going to be, in this particular problem, gas giant, Neptunian, super Earth, meaning they found an exoplanet that's rocky but just gigantic. That one's S. Terrestrial, T, and I just want another row for total. So this is so far what it would look like. And beyond this, we're going to be filling in the inside of the table. So now that we're ready to start, this becomes a pretty tricky one just to get going. But if you make any mistakes here on the frequency, you might lose a point. But if you base your information on the relative cumulative frequency based on what you said here, you're not going to be double docked on anything. So you can only lose a point once if we get a count wrong here. So what we need to do, which is tedious, is carefully count these out. Let me make sure I can fit these in with my penmanship. So as far as the gas giant goes, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm counting 5. Let me know if I come up with a wrong figure there. It's easy to miss these. Then for Neptunian, let me use a different color. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like 5 again. For the super Earth, that's going to be the S variable. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in that category. That leaves just terrestrial, and I'm counting 1, 2, 3 altogether. That gives us a column total of 20 in this column, just adding up all the observations. So that fills out the frequency. Now we go to relative frequency. Any questions with this step here? Okay, as far as the relative frequency goes, this one came with a formula, and the formula went for each cell, we're going to compute the frequency, divide by the total, and we'll leave it as a decimal number. If you converted it into a percentage, I consider that to be a unit change, so I wouldn't worry for the purpose of the exam. I believe my lab kept it as a decimal number, so we'll do the same here. So what this means is we're just taking 5 divided by 20. These are kind of nice numbers, but let's just do it in the calculator anyways to emphasize. 5 divided by 20 gives us exactly 0.25. Same figure here, so 5 divided by 20, or 0.25. Next one is 7 divided by 20. Or a 0.35. Then last, 3 divided by 20 gives us a 0.15. So if you left off the fraction part, that's more for the notes. This is the main part. That's the relative frequency, either as a proportion like we wrote, or as a percentage. Then the total of this should be exactly 1. So it doesn't hurt to double check the answers, add them up, make sure that occurs. And in our table, there's a cell here, but nothing actually goes in that one cell. So if on the exam, you just put an X through that as just a reminder. Not a bad strategy. If you did put a number here, it wouldn't make sense, but I wouldn't dock you for that. We have to fill in 4 more values for the cumulative frequency. But any questions first before we give it a try? Okay, let's state a verbal formula on this one. For the cumulative frequency, in this column, for each cell, take the frequency value to the left So if I'm in this cell, I would be taking that value to the far left, 5, and add up any frequency values above it. So this is the process that was stated in the textbook and in the lecture notes. The first cell is the unusual one. So for the first cumulative frequency, we take that value. It says to add up the values above it, but there are no values above that value at 5. It's the highest one, the top row. So this one defaults to just a 5. Whatever is on the far left is always where cumulative frequency would start. Then on the next one, it says take the value 5, add up any values that are above it. So that's just going to be 5 plus 5 for a 10. Then just keep on going. This says take 7, add 5 plus 5. So that's going to be 17 altogether. Or another way is this 10 is already adding up the values above the 7. So you could just take 7 plus 10 for the same value. If we follow the instructions verbatim, it's really this, 7 plus 5 for the value 17. Take the 7, also add the values directly above it. And there's a nice thing that happens with the cumulative frequency table. This cell is always the table total. But we verified that, that'd be 3. Take the cell to the immediate left in frequency. Plus 7 is 10, plus 5 is 15, plus 5 is 20. Giving us thus our final value. Again, the last one doesn't make sense. If you gave me a value by taking the total, plus the total and put down 40, I'd probably just put an X through it, but you wouldn't ever lose points. So that's the 3 different columns that we would have to build. And that's where the problem ends. For a problem like this, if we wanted to do more, you could build a bar chart based off the frequency, or a bar chart based off the relative frequency, but I separate that out as a whole different problem, either building a bar chart or a histogram. Well, we did it, folks. That's the concept here. Again, this is the major part where a calculator is going to come up. Not huge, heavy calculator work on this exam compared to exam 2. Any other questions on this one or other problem suggestions? While we're thinking of those, I wanted to suggest, let me pick one problem. And if you have other problems you'd like to pick, if I'm kind of overriding a suggestion, again, don't hesitate to ask about it. We'll put it on the notes, put it in chat, and I'll screenshot that into the notes, and we'll make sure to get to that problem. But while we're at this topic, let's do this one here. Construct either a bar graph or a histogram. And it's going to be randomized which one that we're going to use. I'll leave it up to the class. Anyone have a strong feeling? Should we go for a bar chart or a histogram? No one has any strong feelings either way. We can always randomize it. So let's flip a digital coin, essentially. We'll do a bar graph if I get a random number below 0.5. And we'll do a histogram if I get a random number at 0.5 or higher. So here's a random number between 0 and 1. You're supposed to put equals in front of that. Let me try again. It's at 0.9, so that says we'll do a histogram. That's above the 0.5. That's pretty much how I selected these kind of things. If I decided between one or the other, I just randomized it to make it as unbiased as possible. So for the histogram problem, let's go to a new document. Sorry, I've got too many tabs open all of a sudden. I'll go to the new versions of the problems, and this will be not in the solution set. Okay, something like this potentially. No, that one's a time series graph. I said specifically a bar chart or a histogram. This one would be the histogram problem. So here's our next question for the review. This one says, to start off reading through the context, a healthy ecosystem relies on stable populations to maintain environmental balance. And we're told that a team of wildlife biologists is studying the physical characteristics of the local Yellowstone cutthroat trout population in the South Fork of the Snake River. So during the spring survey, these researchers carefully measure the length of each adult trout they safely catch and then release. So these are the lengths of the trout, those specific Yellowstone cutthroat. This is the number that falls between these various lengths. Looks like most of them are between 40 and 44 centimeters in length for the adult fish of that kind. All we're doing here is revisualizing this data. This is essentially just a frequency table, but we want to go beyond what we did in the last problem of just building the frequency and attach graphics to it is essentially what's going on. This one is asking us to specifically construct a histogram, and the major comment that we made on the review guide at the very top is that means there's going to be no gaps between any one of these categories. Only the bar chart would have the gaps between. So let's start this off. Our guidance for building a table says we need a title, then we need a horizontal axis description and a vertical axis description. Let's start with the title. I'm not too picky. Anything that conveys what the context is talking about is going to work. I'll just say briefly that this is the lengths of Yellowstone cutthroat. Let me have a bit of a design choice I want to change. This is the length of the Yellowstone cutthroat, but this said these were the adult trout. So I'll say adult, Yellowstone, Cutthroat, and your title doesn't have to be huge. Sure, it's Cutthroat Trout. Sure, we're talking about the South Fork of the Snake River, but if it feels like your title is just kind of getting huge and you're rewriting the whole problem, that's a good indication that you can cut it short a little bit. It doesn't have to be too long. Just take some of the main elements of the context. Then beyond that, the histogram is going to have a horizontal axis. We don't start it at 0. We want our horizontal axis to contain the data. So we're going to start at 30. Again, there's no gaps, so we're not going to go 30 to 34. We're just going to go to the next 35. Then 40, 45, 50, 55. So essentially what this is saying is, in the histogram, just use the left values that you see in each one of these ranges. So that's our scale. We just want to now say what this is. We can say length in centimeters, just duplicate that. If you said just centimeters, that's okay as well. It's descriptive. And we know we're talking about lengths of adult Yellowstone cutthroat. So even as terse of a title as that does the job. And you know what? The second thoughts, let's leave it like that, just to convey, if we know what these numbers are, because the title tells us what we're talking about, we have a unit, that's a good enough title really for any histogram. Now we need a vertical axis. The vertical axis is going to be frequency. And if you called it a frequency, I would say that's all right. But I think it makes sense to say, excuse me, we should be over here, this column, just to say number of trout, just to make it more specific. So number of trout. Now the histogram and the bar charts, they do start at 0. So now we want an axis that's going to have enough tick marks to contain all the data, but we don't want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 16. You can if you have the time and patience, but it's smarter to go and say by 5s would match for this data. So if you went by 5, 10, 15, and then at 20, so just to contain the higher value at 16, that would make sense for this kind of data. Then we mentioned rulers allowed on the exam if you like, but if you're freehanding this, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to use these little dots as a way to try to do a better job freehanding it. I'm not going to be super picky on how artistic you are or how steady a hand you have on drawing the actual rectangles in the histogram. So these are just my guidelines to help out. So when doing credit for this, I'm going to be looking into the scale you select, if it makes sense to fit the data, the units on each of the axes, and there should be a title as well for your histogram. Any questions at all, folks, before we start throwing in the rectangles? Okay, at this stage, it's again, feels like we're doing a bar chart, but the data is quantitative. That's why there's no gaps between any one of these rectangles. Our first one is going to be at height 3. So visually eyeballing it, that looks like it could be height 3 to me, maybe slightly too tall, but that's okay. Next one's at height 9. So it goes like this. Again, no space between these. It goes right up to the first rectangle. Ends at 40, where the next one takes over. So this one is at height 16. Extends beyond this guideline here. Drops down. Next one right at 10. So go from 40 to 50. Next one is at 4. And one thing I forgot here is if we're going from 50 to 59, well, I have more data going off this way, so I should go one further off to 60 to contain that last region. So that was an omission on my part. So we're on the one at height 4. This one goes just below the guideline at height 5, so about here. That might be slightly too tall, but let's go with it. Does not have to be perfect. Final one is at height 1. Kind of hard to see on the graph, so if you just put kind of a bold line to say that there's something there, that does the job. So there's all of the data for this problem, now contained inside of a histogram. From here, we can discuss further what the shape of the histogram is telling us about the lengths of this fish in that particular area. But any questions at all, folks, to this stage? Okay, as far as part B, it's asking, what does the shape of the distribution suggest about the consistency of the adult trout lengths in the river system? So this is kind of an open-ended question. Depends on how you interpret consistency. By consistency, I would probably just focus on where is most of the data. Well, the highest peak is between 40 and 45. The height is at 16, so 16 trout in that region. But most of the data then goes between 35 and 50 centimeters. So that's how I would personally interpret what they mean by consistency. You could focus on just the one made peak and say the highest category for observations at 16 trout is between 40 and 45. But a high proportion of our data is in this region. So I'll say here, most of the observations for the lengths of trout are between 35 centimeters and 50 centimeters. And if you know more about histograms, if you decide to call this a symmetric distribution, if our exam question is a skewed one and you mention that as well, that'd be fine. We didn't talk about symmetry or skew. We didn't say too much about outliers or the central values, mean, or the spread standard deviation, or medians and interquartile range. But if you know that information, you say it down here, you can't lose points for knowing stuff. So anything you say that's correct, that matches your display as you wrote it, would get full credit for this kind of question. Well, we did it, folks. There's going to be one problem where you have to graph something. There'd be another problem where you have to interpret a graph. But any questions that folks would like to go? Any other directions for our next review question? You know, what I would say for the next question is if we're talking about graphs and we just drew one, maybe another good question would be to interpret one. But let's go with Amy's suggestion first. I think that's a really good idea. That's changing gears by a good amount. And 5A was the first chapter that we looked into, so let's focus on that first, absolutely. Thanks for suggesting that, Amy. Now, as far as 5A goes, some of these are trickier than others, so I think identifying the sampling method is probably not too bad. Sampling methods are given on this sheet right here, so that helps out a lot for exam 3. But that means the first bullet, the first question on the exam, that might actually be the trickier one there. We have to identify 4 different characteristics based on a context: population, sample, parameter, and statistic. So as far as 5A goes, I have the feeling that that could be the trickier question. Let's give that one a look. So I'll go for a new context. We're looking at one at the very top of the notes. This one is to assess the impact of academic pressure. This one is determine the average weekly number of hours studying outside of class. They both seem kind of similar in a certain sense. Let's go with maybe just the first one on the list. Okay, so we are identifying four different things based off a very short write-up on the context. Let's read this carefully once again. In order to assess the impact of academic pressure on student well-being, a team of sociologists emailed a questionnaire to a random sample of 1,200 university students across the state of Idaho. So this tells us how this study was done. It was a questionnaire, so we might have to say something about that, but this is focusing on something entirely different. The survey asked them to rate their average daily stress levels on a scale 1 to 10. 1 is no stress, 10 represents extreme stress, I guess pulling out hair levels of stress. So we need to identify, based off this really short write-up, what is the population, sample, population parameter, sample statistic. You know, this is the order we typically write the questions. It's the order the definitions was given. But notice a key word here. It said random sample of 1,200 university students across the state of Idaho. That's a really big keyword there, almost a dead giveaway for one question already. Let's do part B first. There's nothing that says you have to do these in order. And if something jumps out on you, go for the thing that jumps out on you. Random sample means the sample in this context is the 1,200 university students you could end this and just say the 1,200 university students selected, and that would be totally fine. Describes the sample just fine. But let's be more descriptive and say across the state of Idaho. So if that's the sample, it clues us in on what the population should be. Any volunteers to say what our population must be so far?
University student.
Close. We need to bring in university students. We also have to say across the state of Idaho to really say what the population is. But yeah, you're pretty much on the right track. If the sample is 1,200 of these university students, to say what the population is, we just change this word here to all. And welcome back. I don't know what happened to Zoom. It just crashed out on me. Sorry about that, folks. That's not the first time this has happened. I think this is the second time this semester Zoom has decided to just sort of close and reopen really fast. Just to make sure I didn't lose everyone. Is everyone still able to see and hear me at the moment? Okay, that's good. That's a relief. Thanks, Amy. It says it's still recording, so the recording is just going to look weird. We'll probably just glitch out for a second and come back. Yeah, sorry for that. I don't know what's causing Zoom to crash like that. Bet you it's this computer probably overheating or something. So that's our population. When it says using the context, we have to go beyond just saying university students, because if we just end at university students, it could be misconstrued to mean we meant all university students in the entire nation, USA. This was specifically in the state of Idaho, so we had to tack that part on. So that's the population, that's the sample. Now to come up with both the parameter and the statistic, we're going to be using part A, using part B, but the question is now about what did the study actually measure? It was measuring the impact of stress, and how they did it was everyone in the sample was asked to rate their average daily stress level on a scale of 1 to 10. So we have numerical values for everyone in the sample. That's going to be the known value once they crank out the data. And essentially, if you have the population down, the sample down, just use what they measured using this information here. So for the parameter, I would say this is going to be the average of these daily stress, the daily stress levels for, it says using the context. So let's say again, all in caps like that, just to emphasize, students, well, this was university students, in Idaho. Ran out of space, so let's just make that brief. So that's what the parameter is. This is the unknown in the statistical study. This is the thing they're trying to estimate, learn more about. The sample statistic, well, it's just referring to the same thing that was measured, but these were the actual measurements. It's what we got from the sample. So it's almost goes the same way. We can say the average of daily stress levels for, here we'll say the 1,200. And we can say university students in the state of Idaho, but if you change this to make it a little bit more brief, it's for everyone in the sample, and that's fine to say in this problem. So say for the 1,200 students, let me spell that a little bit better, students in the sample. So that would be a write-up for this kind of question. The more you study these, the more you're going to see what's parallel to these. The sample are just the people that were contacted, the things that were measured. The population is the same things, but we're talking about all of them. We have to use the context to say what the actual population is. Then when you go to say the statistic, it's just going to be the average of whatever you measured for the individuals in the sample, and the parameter is, again, the average of whatever you measured for everybody in the population. So the all and the 1,200 are meant to stand out to show those two things are parallel. Well, any last questions or comments at all, folks, on problem 48? Okay, so there's a lot going on in the Unit 5A. I would say, again, the next two bullets, they're not too bad. Everyone did pretty good on this 5B type question. So we're pretty much have a pretty good coverage. I'd say good ones to take a look into, unless anyone has a suggestion right away, is either a Unit 5A question again, or a 5D question below on analyzing a graph. I think these would be pretty good directions to go. Any volunteers for a new problem to take a look into?
Let's do 5D.
Awesome, good call. Thanks, Braxton. So 5D, let's take a look. Grabbing from the same exam here, or same sample exam here below, fresh problems. And there's lots of them to take a look into here. But you know, I did mention a hint, and I'll mention it again. The quizzes were meant to be practically a dress rehearsal, a dry run on a real exam question. We did this one in the lecture notes, you did it in the MyLab homework, and you also did it as a quiz problem. That's no guarantee it's an exam 3 problem, but it's a massive hint that this looks like something that we should be aware of for exam 3. So let's do this one specifically. And let me put a little check mark there. So that takes care of Unit 5B. And here's our next one to take a look into. So we, again, looked at some pretty complicated graphs. In this 2 versions of the sample exams, some of the graphs didn't even make it into either version. I just felt like some of them were just getting a little too out of hand. We spent a lot of time hand drawing lots of details on some of those problems. But this is a more routine question that really gets at the heart of what we're doing in that section. So this information here is about the net water recharge. We're told it's the difference between the total amount of water that enters an aquifer, like the massive aquifer in the state of Idaho, via rain, snow melt, and maybe other processes, and the amount that's extracted by cities and farms. So we do draw from our own aquifer quite heavily. As the population of Idaho goes up, we draw even more. So it's measured in thousands of acre feet of water. So that's the net water variable on this axis, having a positive and a negative end. A positive value means the aquifer is a net storer. It's gaining water, possibly through rain or otherwise. A negative value means it's a net depleter, meaning we're draining the aquifer on a year-by-year basis. It's losing more water than receives. Figure below shows the net water balance for 5 regional aquifer basins in 2010 and 2050. So 2050 is being the projected year. And, I wish I did a little bit better on this context. It just says randomly basin A, B, C, D, and E. I guess it was harder to fit this to real world data, too much research for this problem. But for this fictitious data here are the questions we want to analyze. Which aquifer basin is projected to undergo the most significant total change in its water balance between 2010 and 2050? I printed numbers on top of these just to show the change, so we didn't have to estimate them with a ruler or anything like that. Basin A changed by 2 units in thousands of acre feet, so that's a lot. But that was the total change here, just it went down 2. This one went down by -15. This is a net depleter of its aquifer in Basin B. This one went down by -28. And this one changed a lot as well. It went down by 18 and 12 more. So this went down by -30. This is the only one that went up. So this one is up by +10. So double checking those numbers, this went down by 28. The difference between 18 and 12, that's going to be down by 30. So based off this information, let me know if you agree or disagree. The one that underwent the most significant total change, either in the positive or negative direction, would be Basin D, losing 30 acre feet. So that's how I would answer a question like this one. It's kind of like a question we've seen, like the most significant reversal in net energy balance for the lecture notes. But any questions at all, folks, on the part A? Okay, then part B says for the next part, in the year 2010, that means we're only looking into the light blue bars on every one of these different categories. Which of these basins were net depleters of water? Net depleters means their storage is in the negative end. So that means we'd be looking into this one would qualify. So with this basin, And this was the largest net depleter in the whole set, but only in the year 2010. So that's one of the confusing elements about this kind of display is the multi-dimensionality of it, the 2 different years. So for this one, we would say just basin B. C, and D. These are the only net depleters amongst the 5. Well, any questions, folks, on either of these so far? I think I'm gonna have to carry this down. Let me put this down on this next screenshot here. Okay, so changing the question. Now, in the year 2050 rather, which of the basins are projected to be net storers of water, meaning they're in the positive end? And notice how tricky this could be if we try to solve this question kind of rapidly. It's really easy for me to just get mixed up and say basin A is on this set because it's here, it's positive. But it's talking about the projected year, the year 2050, which means we have to use the darker blue, the bar to the right. On the real exam, the way I have this shaded is a very light gray and then a dark, dark gray. So even if this is printed in black and white, the key will make sense. The colors are not going to get washed out. And I'm keeping the direction the same, the base year and the projected year to the right. So it says in the year 2050, which of the basins are projected to be net storers? So that means we have to be positive, but only on the projected 2050 year. Basin A does the job. Basin B, C are not looking good. Basin D could be doing better. So can Basin E. That means there's just one here. And again, we have to ignore Basin D. It's positive, but that's 2010. It's not projected to be positive, so they're depleting a lot of water. So here we would say only Basin A. So that does the job for us on this kind of graph question. Again, I think I just kind of gave a massive hint on what to expect on exam 3, a different reformulation of this. Well, on the final exam scenario, it could be any one of these kind of problems. We have a little bit more time. Something like this could potentially come up, problem 60, maybe another mapped problem like we see on problem 59. But this would be kind of the extent of it. There were harder problems that we did on this unit, but this is going to be the 3 main types to expect on a final exam. Well, we've got about 7 minutes and a little bit of change. And we're down to, well, I thought I highlighted that. Let me do it again. We're down to just something in Unit 5A. So let's maybe pick, say, this one right here, identify the sampling method. And that will be our last question for the day. Oh, wait, hang on. What did I check mark there? Oh, that's what I got mixed up on. We actually didn't do that one, but I think that's one people had fun with. That one wasn't too bad from what I noticed on our lecture, as well as the quiz problems that you've all done. So next question to take a look into. Let's go to the very top once again. And I want to go skip down to this question here. This one is supported by the back of the actual exam 3, so you don't have to necessarily write down notes on your exam sheet. For the sampling methods, you could cite the formulas, or excuse me, not the formulas, but the definitions that are here. Hang on, at the very top up here. So let's give these a try. We're looking for which one of these different 5 scenarios match up with a simple random sample, systematic sampling, convenient sampling, cluster sampling, or stratified sampling. These topics are pretty tricky, so one thing I would suggest is when you're doing these, go to this part of the notes for studying, go to the Unit 5A. I feel like this graph does a really good job of saying what is what. Simple random sample, the author's conveying you're using some computerized system. Systematic sampling could be a lot of things, but we didn't go too crazy on this one. Often it meant selecting every nth member of a population or something along those lines. Convenient sampling is just using whoever's readily available. And the last two are the tricky ones. So with that graphic in mind, let's take a look into the specific problems. Part A says, a geologist is studying the soil composition along a newly discovered fault line. They take core samples every 50 meters along the entire length of the fault. So when we read that, oh, hang on, sorry, that grabbed the wrong thing here. When we read that, any volunteers for what kind of sample this one feels like? Yeah, absolutely, Amy, good call. Even though we're not selecting every nth meter, we're taking a core sample every 50 meters, it has all the elements of a systematic sampling, and that's their system. Go every 50 meters along the fault and do a core sample. So systematic sample. On this problem, you don't have to give an explanation. If you want to, you're convincing yourself as well, and you absolutely can. Also, each one of these are going to come up once. So this helps out a little bit. You can reason by elimination on maybe the last couple if you're not sure on. So for the next one, it says, a marine biologist is researching the health of coral reefs. To ensure all depth zones are properly represented, corals can be at different depths and they have different diversity based on them. They select a simple random sample of 20 corals from shallow waters, a random sample of 20 from mid-depth waters, and a random sample of 20 from deep waters. Thinking in terms of what they're doing here, that feels like stratified. Here's a graphic of trying to select two people from one category, two people from another category. Here it's three different categories. They're taking the same sample size. So this one would be a stratified. Random sample. So that's two down. Any questions with this one before we move to the next? Okay, part C is talking about an entomologist, a insect scientist. An entomologist needs to quickly test a newly synthesized non-toxic mosquito repellent. They apply the repellent to their own arms and the arms of three graduate students they just happen to be working in the lab. If you work for labs as this kind of capacity, just say no to anything like this. But that's what's happening in this study. Then there's probably a word missing there. Then they record the number of mosquitoes bites they receive while standing outside of the building. Horrible experiment, but if this experiment runs, what kind of sampling design would you all say this one should be?
Convenience.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just convenient to the entomologist to use their own arms, and the people nearby, the poor lab assistants, the three graduate students, also got roped into this. That's much like what's going on here. They use results that are readily available. So good call, convenient sample. So now we can move on to the next. Here, part D says, an astronomer has a comprehensive database of 4,000 confirmed exoplanets. Kind of similar to our other exoplanet problem we were doing. A computer program uses a random number generator to select exactly 100 of these exoplanets for a detailed atmospheric spectral analysis. You know, we've done something kind of like that before. We imagined we had a sampling frame of all the students in the class. We use a process of random numbers to generate a simple random sample of just the top 5 students after they're given a random number, this whole process of using computers to randomly select in this way is called a simple random sample. So if anything that says there's a database, there's a computer program selecting information, that's kind of what's going on right here with a graphic for the simple random sample. Tells us this one is a simple random sample. I just noticed looking at the clock, we are over time. Sorry about that. I got kind of excited and carried away on these problems. The last one we didn't mention, but by elimination, is cluster sample. And it is in fact a cluster sample because they are, oh dear, kind of control Z that. There we go. What they're doing on the last one is they're dividing up a mountain range, breaking it up into regions like in this graph, and then they're capturing and testing every single sheep, that's what the word I was looking for, within those 3 selected regions. Much like here, 3 precincts were selected, and everybody in the precinct were part of the population. That's the hallmark of a cluster sample. So you won't have the graphics on the real exam, you'll have the full definitions. And that's how that kind of question would go. But sorry for being over by nearly 2 minutes on this one. Any last thoughts or comments at all, folks, on the sample exam review? Okay, well, last thoughts on the exam. Although it's a short exam, you'll notice there's lots of reading to do. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to keep it pretty well contained. Be careful with the context. It's not a bad idea to read the context carefully, answer the question, and then read it again just to make sure your response really fits in with what the context is saying. Well, if you have any questions at all, folks, while you're studying for the exam, don't hesitate to email. I'll be happy to help out. Even over the weekend, I'll be checking my email every morning, just like for the other exams. But otherwise, we won't have class on Monday. It'll be all about the exam, but I'll still be available for help. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need it. Take care, folks, and we'll be back to it on Wednesday of next week after the exam.
Thank you.
You bet. Have a good one.